Or is that up to us?
It's the full hour, so you can go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks so much, Tim. So I want to welcome everybody to our panel discussion on the Poetics of Crisis. We, meaning all of us, will be exploring how crisis gives voice and purpose to poetry and how poetry can give purpose and voice to crisis. In framing our conversation, I'd like to invite you to hold the origin of the word crisis in mind. Crisis, as currently spelled, C-R-I-S-I-S, is a Latinized form of the Greek word crisis, K-R-I-S-I-S, which in its original meaning represents the turning point in a disease, specifically the turning point in a disease where a disease could get better or it could get worse, no promise. The essence again is that turning point. It's that moment of potential. So Theodore, Drew, and I will be speaking to the poetics of crisis from personal and transpersonal perspectives, collective perspectives, all inspired by our shared interests in nature and human nature. And we'll all be sharing a couple of our crisis-themed poems that come from our award-winning collections. Technology willing, we will be opening the floor, inviting your questions. We're particularly interested in a discussion on the potential for poetry to help us reimagine our world post the COVID-19 crisis. And when the time comes with about 5 minutes to share in our 1 hour program, we will be doing a collective closing. So with that, I want to just turn this over to our first panelist, Theodore Richards. Theodore is the founder of the Chicago Wisdom Project and the author of 7 books and the recipient of numerous literary awards. His most recent book, Letter to My Daughters, Remembering the Lost Dimension and Texture of Life, is the winner of an Independent Publisher Awards Gold Medal in Memoir. He has 2 other Independent Publisher Awards, as well as 2 Nautilus Book Awards. Theodore resides in the South Side of Chicago with his wife and 3 daughters. So Theodore, the microphone is now yours.
Thank you, Jamie. You may hear the noise of those 3 daughters somewhere in my house as I'm reading and talking, so hopefully they're not too noisy. So I actually wanted to read, I thought a lot about what to select, you know, a poem, but I actually want to read something that's a little more prose, and I'm going to read a selection from that recent book that you referenced, and then talk a little bit about crisis. I'm writing to you from an airplane, not remembering where I am or where I'm going. If I land in Atlanta, I could still be in Chicago. It doesn't matter. I will find myself in a mall, like a mall anywhere, repeated stores, brands, scenes. Am I flying back from Africa, or is it Heathrow? Maybe it's Jamaica. Somehow I cannot place myself. Do you remember our trip to Jamaica? This was before Vismaya was born, and Calliope just a baby, but you, Cosima, should remember something about it. We went to a wedding at a resort, one of those all-inclusive places. Although we didn't stay at the resort, we spent a day there. It was an awful place, filled with American stores and with ATMs that dispense American dollars. Food notable only for its quantity and blandness. There's no jerk chicken at the resort in Jamaica, for it isn't clear if it's even Jamaica. This is the American dream vacation, travel without depth. Travel in the 2-dimensional world. Travel without really leaving. I fly in planes from one monocultural outpost to the next, thinking back to the days when I used to travel the world. In those days, I once met a man in Australia, an Australian in Samoa, on a flight from one Samoan island to the next, who spent his life installing ATMs in the developing world. He was an absurd and obscene man going on about the prostitutes in Asia. You'll love the girls in Vietnam, he kept saying. You might as well know now that this is how men talk. He bought me beer and lobster and a pia. Then we flew off to Wellington and Sydney, where he was disembarking and I was flying on to Vietnam. From airport to airport, we flew, from airplane to airplane. This was my first stop on a journey that would take me around the world completely. A spherical, three-dimensional journey. A journey of dirt and blood, a journey of taste and bodily sensation. A journey of texture. It never occurred to me that this man's work was flattening the world to remove its texture so he could consume it just as he, in his mind, removed the depth of the girls in Vietnam so we could consume them. I'm writing to you because I want you to live in this world, to feel its fullness, its depth. I want you to fall in love with the world, flawed and sorrowful as it is. Your lives and the world as a whole, these are indistinguishable to me. Depend on this. When I walk the streets of the city or drive its roads, I'm often unable to locate myself. Spaces have been built up in the interest of profit. They are replicable spaces, sterile and climate controlled. No one sweats, no one touches. All this comes back to the screen, which tells you that you are a number, valued in your ability to purchase things, replicable things. And you, a human being, are valued only when reduced to number, replicable like the product. The less human you are, the more valued you are. The less human our culture, the more profitable. The third dimension, depth, has been lost. I can touch the screen, but I cannot feel the world. The question is this: if I cannot locate myself in this new world we've designed, do I even know who I am? Your salvation, our salvation, depends on your ability to rediscover this lost dimension. I fear for you in the world. What I can offer you in this fight you have on your hands seems insignificant in the face of a culture that would flatten the world out and steal your soul, in the face of a civilization that would poison your water and toxify your air. You're called upon to bring the world back to life. This is real work, hard work. I can offer you only memories, stories of the world before it lost its texture, its depth. So I wanted to share some thoughts about crisis and poetics, since that's what we're talking about. And I would just sort of begin by saying that these are apocalyptic times that we're in, which I don't say what that means for me. And part of that is what it means is it's time for new poetics, new words, new stories. So to offer a little bit of historical context for that, the apocalyptic tradition of the Israelites was a time of a new story. The crisis then had to do with Roman imperialism and economic marginalization, but above all else, it had to do with the Hellenistic worldview that was overtaking the traditional Israelite worldview. It was like an unmooring of people from their basic context, from their understanding of who they were and their place in the world. And so the apocalyptic insight of that tradition wasn't about the physical world ending, actually. It was really about the end of a worldview. It was the insight that the stories through which we create our world, when those stories are upended, when they're gone, that's experienced on a psychic level as the end of the world. So in response, the apocalyptics moved from the prophetic tradition, which was about finding transformation in political and historical terms, to a cosmic transformation, a complete upending, reimagining of the order of the world. The first shall be last. So here we are now at an apocalyptic moment. The old order is ending, and we can approach it with fear that regresses to fascism, clinging to the old order, right? Or we can embrace something new. And we have to remember that a world is put together as a community, as a culture. We know our place in the world through our poetics, and this is how we make our worlds. So the big question right now is what story we will tell. The global crisis that we face now is as much an inner crisis, a matter of inner climate change, as much as it is that the outer climate change. We conceive of ourselves as mere consumers, as isolated individuals, rather than part of the web of life. And as I mentioned in the reading, the two-dimensional screen worlds that we inhabit render us without depth, render us unable to really feel and fall in love with the texture of the world. It's worth noting that this shouldn't be that we're not seeking a single story. We're seeking a tapestry of stories. In fact, part of the actual problem that we have now is that the stories that give us our place in the world have been reduced down to a single story, that sort of monoculture of global capitalism. It's also unlikely to come from the centers of power. The work I've done here in Chicago at the Chicago Wisdom Project has been about creating spaces and processes for people who otherwise were marginalized to tell their stories, places of listening. So it isn't just about telling, it's also about deep listening and creating those spaces in which to reimagine and listen and share. So I'll stop there. And I'd like to pass the mic off to Drew. And
hello, everyone.
I'm going to give you a brief, I'm just pulling up your bio. I'm going to give you your bio, Drew. Drew Lanham, PhD, is a cultural ornithologist who blends bird ecology, wildlife conservation, poetry, and creative writing to broaden inquiry and understanding of nature, connection across racial and ethnic divides. He's the author of The Home Place, Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love Affair with Nature, a chronicle of higher education book of the decade. He's also the poet laureate of his home county of Edgefield, South Carolina, and the author of Sparrow Envy poems.
Thank you, Theodore. And towards this issue of poetics and crisis and the basis for it, and the sort of, as Theodore talked about, the apocalyptic nature of it, I'd like to spend some time talking in my time about immediacy, persistence, and purpose. And so in that line, I'll sort of share the immediacy of personal poetic and the importance of it, the persistence from which that sort of arises and based upon who I am as an ornithologist and a scientist, but also who I am as sort of a poet come lately, I think, and then the purpose of it, hopefully, in that time. COVID-19 is just another crisis in a series of crises visited upon those of us with ethnic precondition. Black or brown skin is licensed for a societal infection, the pestilence of injustices heaped upon bias. We die by acute police brutality, arrest, trial, and execution by suspicion where we stand, by denial of basic rights, by lack of clean water to drink, starving in food deserts, living on the wrong side of the tracks in a right-wing test tube. We are the lab rats, poked, prodded, given lethal doses of prejudice. James Baldwin said that Negroes should be pissed off at the persistent struggle. I happen to agree. We are, to the nation we helped build, mostly a disease. We've been socially distanced now for some 400 years, quarantined in separate and unequal boxes with blankets left over from the native purges. We adapted. We vaccinated and immunized ourselves with strength and resilience, and somehow survived all the outbreaks of dark middle passage holes, of chains, of whips, of rape, castration, of maiming, murder, of lynching ropes, votes discounted, communities redlined and power gerrymandered. Now this. Almost 100,000 in body bags are in the ground. We die in multiples as whiteness suffers in singles. No less saddened in the losses, mind you. But they add by fingers as our numbers roll past digits on hands and feet already missing pieces chopped off because of sugar diabetes. Diagnosed with living while Black. It's a chronic condition within the crisis. Yes, I'll stay at home, first to not infect someone else, but then to not be shot down in the street by some vigilante American seeing me as the more dangerous threat. The rising seas will drown us first if the pandemic of racism doesn't win this race. You see, the crises for some of us is cast in historic stone, indelibly linked into who we are by the color of our skin. It is not one viral outbreak. It is daily more than most ever calculate, more than the talking heads can read or the bottom of the screen tickler can scroll. Life is an immediate thing for us all, an equal chance at living is all we ask. Trouble comes from under everyone, late or that right soon. For some it visits and sits down to stay. Then crisis is no longer something to think of as disrupting normal. It is normal. So we ask how the poet's words impact crises, or how crises impact the poet's words. It's an Ouroboros of sorts. How do words and verse, rhymed or not, evenly lined or raggedly torn, help us cope in times of struggle? Some might argue that art is the privilege we can ill afford to partake of in such critical times. I would argue that it is as essential as air or water or equitable health care. So the crisis now, I think, is, we all know, is simply exacerbated by other crises, from microaggressions to fatal violence openly enacted on public streets to national trends denoting an entire race as an at-risk status. Let's think about that. That your race gets you a leg up, so to speak. So how can words help? I would argue, as many far greater before me have, that silence is the much deeper sin in any time of crisis. To not write or to not speak, to not yell, to not scream, to not paint, to not carve, to not sculpt, to not sing is dereliction of our duty as creators. And so I offer that this is a silver-plated lining in the dark cloud that must be taken advantage of. Social media, I would argue, is the megaphone of immediacy that we have beyond waiting on the printed page ultimately. Daily tweets are slung like so much dung from a house on Pennsylvania Avenue. Lives and fortunes and assistance checks and pensions rise and fall on single words, often misspelled or used in improper context. And so if malformed words from one orange-tinted hand can tilt the earth on its axis, then I will posit that we cannot sit on our own black or brown or white or red or yellow hands to allow the polemics of ignorance and vanity to outpace the poetics of calamity. And so for those of us who've been wrapped in crisis since the ships first anchored off mid-Atlantic shores in 1619, thoughts and words are really all we possess that cannot be chained or stolen or stoled away. And so in the tradition of my people, I have the responsibility to speak out and loudly as I can at that, towards undermining the crisis where I might, so that when we come out of this, we are past what was normal. And so I think that'll be the power in our poetics, to use the tools laying in front of us to be immediately loud, to be boisterous, to be bold, to tell our stories however we can, to not wait on the privilege of glossy publication. That might take too long. To update your status, to Instagram those pictures, to tweet against the bombastic stream, to TikTok, or whatever way we can, in whatever way we can, some truth artfully expressed. Those are messages in Poetics in Crisis I call essential breath. So I think I might be leaving a few minutes on the clock, but that's okay. I'd like to introduce Jamie. Dr. Reaser, Dr. Jamie K. Reaser, is an ecologist, a philosopher, a communications psychologist, and an award-winning writer. Jamie has published 12 books and over 100 articles in scientific and literary magazines. Last month, her two most recent books, Ridgelines and Conversations with Mary, won Nautilus Book Award medals. Through her private counseling practice and on behalf of various organizations, she uses her deep understanding of soul-centric language to guide people through crisis-invoked transformation. She resides in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Central Virginia. Jamie?
Thank you, Drew. So I want to revisit, to start off, the frame of reference for crisis that I gave at the beginning of our panel discussion. So reminder, the word crisis that we use today, C-R-I-S, is a Latinized form of the Greek crisis, K-R-I-S, which references that turning point in disease where disease could get better or worse. So from my perspective, crisis in the broadest sense is an instigator of an archetypal story pattern that's consistent with ancient myth. Theodore referred to some in a mythopoetic tradition, but it's also well represented in modern adventures that we're all familiar with. Another example from mythology that you may be familiar with Crisis would be that moment when Hades takes Persephone by the ankles and drags her into the underworld, which is often referred to as the realm of soul. We're part of a psychology conference here at the moment, so it's relevant to mention crisis in the context of the Jungian psychology approach to the hero's journey, as described in Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero of a Thousand Faces. So crisis would be that moment that causes the hero to have to embark on that journey. And simply put, for the purposes of our conversation, the hero's journey is a journey of departure, of initiation and return, but the hero is never able to return to their pre-journey self or their pre-journey context in terms of the way they move through the world. Other examples, more recent examples from pop culture that represent crisis-driven journeys. Indiana Jones in that moment when he had to go into the darks and depths and face his greatest fears, which in that storyline were embodied as snakes. It's also crisis that sent Frodo and friends on the journey to have to pitch the ring into the fiery, I guess we call it magma or a lava of depths. So it's crisis that causes us to embark on what's an often unanticipated and uninvited journey that is typically fraught with perils. But ultimately, it is a journey in which we are to be in service of something that's greater than the pre-journey self, that's greater than the self in particular. So it's crisis that I would say enlists the ego, in my mind, the necessary ego, in service of the soul. And I refer to the soul as the deepest, most authentic part of ourselves. So another way of looking at this is that crisis is the great initiator, that word being key, the great initiator of human and humanity, or at least it has the potential to go back to the original meaning of the word crisis. It's a point of potentiality that's offered up to us, and what we do with it ultimately determines better or worse, and how we interpret what better and worse mean to us and society as a whole. So what does this have to do with poetry? So in modern times, at least and from the standpoint of Western culture, our ego, which tends to be our driver of norms at this time, the ego speaks through linear rational thought. The voice of the soul, our deeper authentic self, speaks through image, sound, feeling, and metaphor. The language is poetics. The language of the soul is poetry. It's poetry that has the potential, thus, to give voice to the soul at personal and transpersonal, at collective levels, speaking to and guiding the soul of the world, particularly in times of crisis, particularly when we as individuals and collectively are invited into that mythopoetic underworld journey. So from my perspective, poetry, when it's doing its work, aligns with the positive intent of crisis. Aligns with the positive intent of crisis. And if we lean into poetry, if we surrender to it, and the often uncomfortable edges of the words and the phrases that poetry offers us, we let it do its work on us. We invite it to work with us. and ultimately for us individually and collectively. Poetry, when it's soul-centric poetry in the way I'm describing it, demands a courageous vulnerability. It demands that of the poet, and it demands it of the reader, or I would say the experiencer. And it is that courageous vulnerability that carries the potency of crisis, the potency that the crisis needs to offer up a turning point. Without the courageous vulnerability, that turning point does not become available to us. So I want to offer 3 what I call poetic soul tasks, and I'm going to share 2 poems quickly. So the first is to apprentice to poetry, particularly during this time of potential turning point. And by apprenticing to it, I do not mean to read it. I mean to lean into it, to try it on, to wear it around for a while. And I don't mean to write it. I mean to surrender to it, to let it have its way with you. Secondly, I want to offer an opportunity to shift your neurology from the linear rational mind as a dominant way of experiencing and expressing. So anatomically, this would mean moving from left brain to right brain, or the enteric nervous system, our gut, what many traditional cultures refer to as the seat of the soul, or the soul seat, particularly in the area of the navel. So one simple exercise to shift neurologically is to start just stating with your left hand when you're having conversations. And just notice how that changes your language patterns and how it changes the conversation content and the receptivity of those you're in conversation with. Now, for some of you, this may require you to sit on your right hand in order to actually give your left hand the fluidity of potential to keep your right hand from silencing it. And if that's the case, just notice how much opportunity you need to give that left hand in conversation. And third, I want to invite you to explore the essence of words, to move words out of the realm of inanimate object that we just plunk down next to each other to form what's called a sentence, and then a paragraph and a page and a book and so forth. To move into the essence of the reason words were burst into the world and the inherent service that they were originally intended to give. So just by way of an example, again, that's timely, the word virus in its origin actually means to melt away. So if we look at our current crisis from the standpoint of melting away, what is it at the personal and collective level that we are being given an opportunity for better or worse to melt away right now? Just stepping into the essence of the word virus in its original meaning and energies can create an entirely different way of holding experience. So now I'm going to quickly share 2 poems. The first one is one of the very first poems I published. This is a 2003 poem, and it is called Callings. Do you hear yourself being called to places that are far away, beckoned by landscapes intimately known and unimaginable? Does it feel as only strangers can speak your name? You must leave home. You must leave home. Escape the walls of your upbringing any way you can. Caterpillars do it. Travel far and wide, get lost, be robbed over and over again. Realize the world is big, you are small. Forget who you believed yourself to be, who others thought you were. Become someone who can't answer simple questions like, what do you do? Fail. Totally and completely fail to reach your intended destination, though carrying a map and compass. You are where you need to be the moment after you give up. on all the landmarks. Sit down and cry out your laments. Cry out the laments all of your ancestors feared to cry. You are indeed walking in circles, downward, inward, along a path marked grief and despair that leads directly to soul. You have arrived at the place you began, that it killed you to leave. There is no entrance, no exit, never was. When people ask you to tell the story of your travels, your journey, of the road that you have taken, do so by living your life ecstatically. Now you are human. And the second one is a more recent poem. This is a 2017 poem that has not been published. It has just been submitted in a new collection of poems that I put out for consideration called Truth and Beauty. And this one's called Morning. Morning spelled Mourning, as in mourning dove, consistent with Drew's ornithological background. And it's not about a mourning dove, but this could be the essence of the mourning dove's coo. All of our griefs come to us on the last day of something. An unmet wish, that which we thought was safe and true, someone we had permission to touch. Now is not the time to close your eyes, but to see your way into the darkness of mourning. Here is where we are witnessed by sorrows too abundant to dismiss. Here is where we realize that we don't want the broken repaired and the wounds healed. Here is where we are initiated into true humanity. I want you to go below the waters and stand knee deep in the ash and listen to the sound of breath withheld. I want your heart to pine for what had been there until it can stop living the dream of entitlement. Do with your knees what they were built to do. To support you upon the ravaged earth in the moment that you realize that grief is a fearsome creature that knows you by name. Surrender. Until you do, the gods will not reveal what it is that you must stand for. Yes, I know that you want me to tell you about beauty, but I'm not going to. Other than to say that it will be there. It will greet you. And it is possible to accept its invitation too soon. So now Theodore is going to open it up and we are going to invite your voice. We want to know what's stirring for you, and particularly what questions you have that could guide us into a conversation about the poetics of reimagining crisis at this time, at this potential turning point. Theodore, you'll need to take it off mute. There you go. All yours.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. So if you have questions or even sort of, speculations or thoughts, please share them in the Q&A, and I will read them.
Wait, any coming in, Theodore?
No, not yet. Oh, here we go. Okay. Okay. This is from Robert Bashara, my good friend. Hi, Rob. He says, thank you for a great panel. My question's for Drew. Is poetry enough, or do we also need to take action against an oppressive world?
Thank you for the question. I certainly think it's a good start. I don't think it's enough. And to Jamie's point about how we speak and the intentionality of our words, I think poetry is an act. It is an act, and it can be a first act. It can fall anywhere in that spectrum, I think. But I think its power, even beyond a long essay or a book, is that there's some edge to it. There is some grit to that act of being vulnerable enough, as Jamie says, to write the poem in the first place, and then being courageous to accept those words as they come through you. So I think if we're doing it the right way, that there is some energy exerted in that act of creating the poem, not just writing the words, but creating it. That we wake with words on our mind, or we go to bed with those words on our mind, and they live somehow differently in the poet than they do in other word creative processes. So no, it's never enough, just as one poem is never enough, I think. And I think one often builds on the other. But my hope is that Poetics in Crisis can lead us to think about other things. I mean, I'm a bird-brained guy, so I'm always thinking about birds. But my mind is constantly going back and forth between the beauty of birds in my backyard and the struggles of those birds, and people dying in the street, and injustices enacted on human beings and the earth. So those things, that's an act, and it's an exhausting one, I think many people can testify to.
Yeah, I would just like to add that, I think sometimes, as you alluded to, Drew, the line between action and poetics is not always a rigid one. I think it's a blurry line. Oftentimes, I think in order for there even to be action, or in order for people to know what action is required, we need a shift in our words and our language, and to actually begin to feel. I think of what poetry often does is it invites the reader, the listener, into the world of another, into the viewpoint of another, and reveals to us the kind of common humanity, perhaps, that we have with that person. One of our great challenges, I think, that we have in the midst of crisis is to actually recognize another's humanity, and I think poetry is like a possible way to begin to do that a little bit, and to shift our way of thinking, for sure. Thanks, Drew.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that too, Theodore. Drew framed it from, poetry can be an act, but I also think, to reframe it the other way, an action can be poetic. And that is to say, if the action that you take shifts the storyline to that point of potential, that turning point, for better or worse, and brings a consciousness forward that gives people that choice point of surrender towards something different that ultimately is more in service of society collectively, that act is poetic. It serves the full intent of poetry's mission in the world. And so the question that I would put out to our listeners in their own daily reflection is, what are the poetic acts that you could be bringing into the world at this point in time.
Have any other questions?
Going through, Theodore, otherwise we can pick up on the questions we have for each other.
Yeah, maybe we should do that because we don't have, nothing's coming through right now. So let's go ahead and do that.
Drew, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I'm thinking about crisis and how, for lack of a better word, how deeply intense these experiences have been for all of us, and I'm sure for, for the world, really. But as creators and being sort of in this crucible, I'd like to ask each of you how your daily routine as poets, as writers, if it's changed, and how has it changed? And is there ever any feeling of, I don't know, any feeling of sort of guilt for being able to create out of the morose nature of things? I mean, when the immediacy of writing a poem when someone is shot down in the street, or someone where the toll of numbers goes past, and then trying to blend beauty into that. I spend lots of days sort of confused. And so I'd sort of like to know where you two are in that process and in this sort of crucible that we're in.
Theodore, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, from where I sit here on the south side of Chicago, I think there is, you alluded to this, Drew, in your poem. I think this is for certainly for my neighbors. The crisis has been ongoing, for a long time, and it's sometimes, I don't think guilt is the word, but I think it certainly is. I think art and poetry is an act of resistance and of survival in many ways, in terms of like really experiencing deep crisis, watching, this among the different things that I have had to do since in the last couple of months is be here every day teaching my children, which is in some ways an act of poetry in itself. Hear them in the background, I think. The other day we had to talk to my 12-year-old about what to do when someone starts shooting, what's the right action there, there's an intensity to that life, which I think, and a pain and a sorrow, but there's also, I think, a richness to it. I think that and a beauty to that life that we're living here, and fighting and continuing to thrive and flourish, so poetry allows us to see, and certain kinds of language allow us to see that the crisis that another's experiencing is our own crisis, I think. And I think that that's the only way to really thrive and survive in this world, is to begin to see how we share those commonalities.
So it's a great question, Drew. I think for me, the shifts have come not so much stylistically with regard to poetry, but the shifts have come in terms of the questions that I'm holding in the poetic container, so to speak. The listening is different for those that aren't poets. I would put out there that poetry is actually a process of listening, I think, more than writing, particularly soul-centric poetry. It's listening for the words that are already hanging out there, you know, waiting to be taken up into relationship. So my listening process is, I think, a bit bolder, more intentioned, broader, you know, intentionally listening across the humanscape, you know, less about the personal journey. I think I also feel a greater responsibility and attentiveness to the words that I'm sharing. To go back to your references to social media, all of us have blogs, Facebook pages, etc., through which we share verse, and a greater sense of responsibility in attending to the resonance that those words will have, but also a greater sense of responsibility to the words themselves, to get the poems out, to do the work that they're intended to do in the world. They're not mine. I'm just a translator, and a way that they can get into the world to do their work. So certainly a greater sense of responsibility. I'd also add to that I feel a greater sense of blessing. Drew and I are both PhD scientists, and you know, also have this linear, rational world that we have to fully step into at times. But I feel so blessed to have also been born into this poetic aspect of self that allows me to move in any given day from writing an article for science on issues related to infectious disease and wildlife, and 30 minutes later, you know, have a poem drop in that shifts my entire perspective of not only my personal but transpersonal experience through the journey we're going through, and to be able to encourage others to pick up the full embodiment that this time is offering us of linear rational mind working in service of the greater poetic potential, I think is something not to take lightly. It's something to revere.
Thanks, Jamie. There's a bunch of questions have come through. So
Great.
we don't have a lot of time left. So let's try to do quick answers to these so we can get to them. Does that sound cool?
Let's do.
All right.
All good.
Okay. So you can see we got like 5 more questions. All right. So from Maria says, how does poetry as a deeply personal expression come to influence or affect social change and transformation? Theodore, you beautifully mentioned, oh, thank you, Maria. Hi, Maria. Allows us to see a crisis and share commonalities. How does this transcend the personal to the social? And I would just, I'll just really quickly say that, you know, I think that, as I mentioned before, it's kind of like, I think that, to put it in different words, I think one of the gifts that poetry offers is it offers a way to sort of enter into another's subjectivity, right? And make that experience become alive, not just as an abstraction, but as a real thing, a thing that's felt, you know? So I just would quickly say that.
Well, for me, really, you know, poetry is sort of policy, honestly. And I teach my students in my policy class that all policy begins with personal agenda. And so I think that poetry as personal agenda and potentially policy has the power to expose others to not only one's own vulnerability, but perhaps the vulnerability of a community or a segment of society that they are unaware of, and to do so quickly, that maybe it's a flash flood that overwhelms in ways. So I certainly think that it has that power.
I think you both covered that well, and for the sake of time, I'll pass in order more questions to come through.
Yeah, cool. So Karina asks, she says, I believe that to make paradigm shifts in the heart of humanity, we must change the metaphors we live by. Can you talk about it? And I think that's a great point. A lot of the work I've done is around kind of the notion of metaphor and how the metaphors really inform our worldview, you know, and I talk about a lot of our, you know, in our schools, for example, we often think of our schools, we use metaphors for the world based on kind of like factories or machines or these mechanistic metaphors, or oftentimes we use like the metaphors of capitalism, like, you know, competition and those sorts of things. And even in some cases, we use metaphors of the prison for our children in our schools here in the United States. So, when we use, anytime we're trying to, you know, develop someone's way of thinking about the world, we are sort of creating small worlds for them with the metaphors that we use. And I think that's absolutely fundamental to kind of shift the paradigm.
Yeah, to go back to what Theodore mentioned early on in terms of story and the need for a new story. Metaphor is short story. It's the essence of story. And if I had to say it as simply as possible for given our time, what we really need is metaphor that moves us from that linear, rational kind of self-oriented projection into the world to metaphor that brings us into relationship to systems thinking, where we see ourselves as part of rather than apart from the whole.
Metaphor should be transcendent to me. So, you know, I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but for me, it's those blurry lines that Theodore talked about, crossing back and forth from humanity, not just humans to humans, but humans to other beings.
Yeah, thank you. So next is from Hillel. You refer to poetry or poetics. How broadly do you define that? What all does poetry encompass? Does it ever move beyond words and include other creative expression?
Yes.
When you answer first, I can jump right in. Yeah.
Yeah. So as I
it does.
Yeah. For me, absolutely.
It's life. Yeah, it's life really. I think it's life and well crafted, not written as Jamie said, but well crafted. It expresses that life.
Yeah, that's really well.
And to go into that, I would say that it's associated life. It's life, you know, fully embodied rather than witnessed in a dissociated way. It's moving the inanimate into the realm of the animate, where you're imbuing words and experiences and processes with some aspect of spirit.
You know, I often think of poetry and its, you know, in its kind of original origin, the original origins of the word as simply making. It's making worlds, right? And I think of, you know, I watch my kids play. They're always making every day they got a new world they've created of some sort, and then it all falls apart and they build one again the next day. That's poetry. You know, it's play in a lot of ways. So, okay, next, Catherine. We're doing well. We're moving through these questions well. Okay, we've got a few more though. They're coming in fast.
Catherine says, 5-minute warning too, Theodore.
Yeah. So Catherine says, "Can you say?" Oh yeah. Well, maybe we'll do. Catherine's waiting for us, so maybe we'll do one more. Can you say something about the interior process of how poetry works towards transformation in both the individual and in communities?
The internal process. I think, well, first of all, there's an assumption that I'm somehow representative. So I have to live with that assumption as a scientist. You know, there are assumptions that we make. So this assumption, I have to understand internally. I have to understand my connections. I have to understand my privilege. I have to understand my vulnerability. I have to understand my oneness, but I have to also understand my togetherness with others. And that comes from the inside. I can't look on the outside, and just as I can't make assumptions about every bird based upon one bird, I can't make assumptions about every person, every Black person, every white person, every whomever person based upon one person. So there are assumptions that I have to overcome internally. And part of that is being hands open and out as a poet and expressing my vulnerability so people understand where I'm coming from.
You want to say anything to that, Theodore?
I think that's really well said. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think it is too. And I think a key point of what Drew was referencing in that statement is the word openness. The internal process to be in relationship to poetry has to be one of openness and receptivity. And in times of crisis, again, that takes us back to the word vulnerability and allowing what's coming through to enter you.
So I think we have a closing poem to read and probably should do it now. Does that sound
Yeah,
right?
any final word before we do that you all wanted, anything you wanted to say that hasn't been said? From you, Theodore or Drew?
Daily try to find the poem, try to find the poetic, or let it find you.
And I'd invite a listening with the ears of the poet to the experiences that life is offering right now.
Yeah, the writing part is only the tip of the iceberg. The rest of the work is there, I think. You know, yeah.
So we're now going to collectively share a poem with you from Rainier Maria Rilke. It's entitled, "I am much too alone in this world, yet not alone." So Theodore, you want to start us off?
Much too alone in this world, yet not alone enough to truly consecrate the hour.
I am much too small in this world, yet not small enough to be to you just object and thing, dark and smart.
I want my free will and want it accompanying the path which leads to action, and want during times that beg questions where something is up to be among those in the know, or else be alone.
I want to mirror your image to its fullest perfection. Never be blind or too old to uphold your weighty, wavering reflection.
I want to unfold. Nowhere I wish to stay crooked, bent, for there I would be dishonest, untrue.
I want my conscience to be true before you.
I want to describe myself like a picture I observed for a long time, one close up.
Like a new world I learned and embraced.
Like the everyday jug.
Like my mother's face.
Like a ship that carried me along through the deadliest storm.
Thank you all. We appreciate your presence. This will be offered at a later date on recording, and we hope you'll help us share it with others. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Be well.